I would like now to introduce Dr. Dwayne Gish, who will speak for the side of creationism. Dr. Gish received his bachelor's degree from University of California, Los Angeles, with a major in chemistry, and obtained his PhD in biochemistry from the University of California at Berkeley in 1953. He has held research positions at the Cornell University Medical College in New York City and at the Virus Laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley. In 1960, he joined the Upjohn Pharmaceutical Company in Kalamazoo, Michigan as a research associate, where he spent 11 years. He resigned from that position in 1971 in order to devote himself full-time to the study of the evidence relating to the evolution-creation question being debated here tonight. He is now Associate Director of the Institute for Creation Research in San Diego. Dr. Gish.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siegfried. Dr. Robinson, ladies and gentlemen, certainly it's a great pleasure and privilege for me to be here this evening and to have this opportunity of presenting the scientific case for creation. And that is what I do plan to do this evening, setting aside any of my own preconceived ideas or religion or that of Dr. Robinson. I want to discuss the scientific evidence. Now, I'd like to point out that Dr. Robinson spent, I believe, about 25 minutes discussing my religion and my beliefs, and the fact that I do accept the Bible. And that's true. But ladies and gentlemen, that is irrelevant here tonight. I want you to judge the case for creation versus evolution on the basis of the scientific evidence that I am presenting tonight. And certainly Dr. Robinson's religious views are irrelevant as far as what he has presented here tonight, or as far as Simpson presents, or Huxley. And Dr. Robinson, while making much of the point that it's immaterial whether Simpson is an atheist or Huxley, and I agree, but I would like the same accorded to myself. It is irrelevant whether I am a Christian and a believer, or whether I'm an atheist, or I just don't care. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of creationists who are not Christian, who are believing Jews or believing Muslims, or just don't believe much of anything, but are convinced that the scientific evidence and the nature of things does demand a supernatural origin of this universe. Now, as a matter of fact, the evolutionist does have some very strong preconceived ideas. Dr. Robinson has adequately documented ours, so I'd like to document his. In his book, Early Hominid Posture and Locomotion, on page 212, Dr. Robinson says, quote, "The conceptual framework within which a student works shapes the viewpoint from which he approaches the material being studied, and powerfully influences the conclusions that he draws." End of quote. Then on page 248, in reference to the logic underlying his view of the genus, he gives several points. He says that his view is based upon evolution is a fact. Now that is Dr. Robinson's belief, that's his conviction, that evolution is a fact. And you see his conclusions then will be, as he said on page 212, will be shaped by this assumption that evolution is a fact. And so, of course, we all have some preconceived ideas as we approach this problem. But that's just what we have to deal with. All of us have preconceived ideas. And certainly evolution has been and can be used as a religion. As a matter of fact, Julian Huxley and Bronowski, in their book, Growth of Ideas, state that evolution can be used as a religion. It can replace God. It can be used in the same way as God was in the past. Marjorie Green, one of the leading philosophers and historians of science, in her article in Encounter, November 1959, says that it is as a religion of science that Darwinism chiefly held and holds men's mind. And then later on she says, today, the modified but still characteristically Darwinian theory has itself become an orthodoxy, preached by its adherents with religious fervor, and doubted, they feel, only by a few muddlers, imperfect in scientific faith. And so certainly there are preconceived ideas brought to bear here, but it comes from both sides. And as Dobzhansky himself has stated, the philosophy that dominates the scientific establishment today is this philosophy, materialism, mechanism, and so forth, this mechanistic, materialistic philosophy, stated so eloquently by Jacques Monod, for example, in his book Chance and Necessity. This is the philosophy that dominates our educational and our scientific establishments. And of course, if that's true, then that will shape the conclusions of this establishment as it relates to origins. But be that as it may, let's consider the scientific evidence tonight. I want to point out, however, that we creationists do not really stand alone in our challenge to the modern theory of evolution, its mechanisms and so forth, supposed to have operated. We find that the theory is under attack. The modern theory of evolution is under attack in all of its aspects by one or other of evolutionists, on the basis of probability theory, on the basis of the laws of thermodynamics, on the basis of the fossil record itself, on the basis of all the facts of biology. One of these, for example, is Pierre Grasset. Dr. Dobzhansky wrote a review of the book by Grasset. He published this review in Evolution, volume 29, June of 1975. Now, the book by Grasset was entitled L'évolution du vivant. It's in French, but Dobzhansky reviewed the book. And listen to what Dobzhansky had to say about this book. He says, quote, "The book of Pierre P. Grasset is a frontal attack on all kinds of Darwinism. Its purpose is to destroy the myth of evolution as a simple, understood, and explained phenomenon, and to show that evolution is a mystery about which little is and perhaps can be known." Now, one can disagree with Grasset, but not ignore him. He is the most distinguished of French zoologists, the editor of the 28 volumes of Traité de Zoologie, author of numerous original investigations, and ex-president of the Academy of Sciences. His knowledge of the living world is encyclopedic. End of quote. Here's a scientist whose knowledge of the living world is encyclopedic, a man who is characterized as the most distinguished of all French zoologists, who's written a book that's a frontal attack on all kinds of Darwinism. Grasset is convinced that the facts of biology cannot explain origins. As a matter of fact, in his concluding sentence, which Dobzhansky quotes, he says, and this is the sentence, quote, "It is possible that in this domain, biology impotent yields the floor to metaphysics." End of quote. So what Grasset is saying, that it's impossible in this domain, that is the domain of origins, that biology is impotent. It cannot explain anything, and therefore perhaps must yield the floor to metaphysics. Metaphysics, of course, would involve the supernatural, or certainly something beyond the physical. Now, it is true, ladies and gentlemen, that in explaining natural phenomena, a scientist, by definition, cannot appeal to the supernatural. And I agree 100% with that. When I go in the laboratory and work as a biochemist, I do not appeal to the supernatural. I assume that what happened today happened yesterday and will happen tomorrow. And that's the only way a scientist can operate. But how do we know? By what objective criteria can any scientist establish that the universe and that life itself and that living things arose by natural phenomena? How can you do that? You can't. It is an assumption that you may make, but it cannot be established by any objective scientific criteria. Obviously, there were no witnesses to the origin of the universe. There were no witnesses to the origin of life. There were no witnesses to the origin of a single living thing. Therefore, to say that we cannot appeal to the supernatural to explain origins is simply not true. Now, they may not have happened by supernatural processes. That's true, but they may not have happened by natural phenomena. As a matter of fact, it is our position that the laws of science, the facts of genetics and biology, and the fossil record itself tells us that this universe could not have evolved. On the basis of known natural laws and processes, a universe could not have generated itself. It could not have transformed itself from some primordial disordered state by natural processes into this highly ordered universe that we have today, that on the basis of known natural processes and physical laws, it's impossible that simple gases could have spontaneously transformed themselves into highly precisely ordered proteins and DNA and RNA molecules with precise biological activity, that these molecules somehow could have spontaneously and naturally organized themselves into a living cell, and that living cell then could have transformed itself into the millions of species that we have upon the earth today through some hundreds of millions of years time. We cannot do that. Therefore, we say that the only alternative, spatial creation, then certainly is a viable alternative. It is a reasonable alternative. We are simply trying to establish by the nature of the scientific evidence, which is more credible, creation or evolution. As scientists, we should be seeking the truth, regardless of whether we can use scientific theories in the search for that truth. And in that connection, I want to emphasize that there is no scientific theory on origins, either creation nor evolution. Evolution is not a scientific theory. Theories that are scientific deal with events that are observable, properties and processes that can be observed and tested. How can you test any theory on the origin of the universe? How can you test any theory on the origin of life? How can you go in the laboratory and recreate the process to see if it really would produce life or a universe? How can you test any theory on the origin of any living thing? These are unique historical events that took place in the past. That's not the stuff of science. Science must involve theories that can be tested by observable processes, and that cannot be done in evolution. An increasing number of scientists are beginning to recognize this, and they are saying so, evolutionists. C. Leon Harris, L. Harrison Matthews, Ehrlich and Birch, and others like that have stated frankly that evolution cannot be a scientific theory because the processes cannot be observed nor tested. Even if evolution were occurring in the present world, it would take 100,000 years, perhaps, maybe 1,000,000 years or more. Certainly many, many thousands of years to produce the kind of change necessary to document and validate the theory of evolution. Therefore, it cannot be called a scientific theory. Now, it doesn't say it isn't true. It just says it's no more scientific than creation. And I think we can show it's just as religious. And we find many problems with evolutionary theory, much that cannot be explained. That's all right. But we want to understand that we do not have an explanation for evolution today, certainly. Richard Lewontin is one of the leading geneticists in this field of study. And in his book, The Genetic Basis of Evolutionary Change, published in 1974, Lewontin has said, quote, "It is an irony of evolutionary genetics that although it is a fusion of Mendelism and Darwinism, it has made no direct contribution to what Darwin obviously saw as the fundamental problem, the origin of species." End of quote. Well, if this genetics, whatever he's talking about, can make no contribution to our knowledge of the origin of species, you certainly couldn't call it evolutionary genetics. I don't know why we could call it evolutionary genetics. A little later, on that same page, page 159, Lewontin says, in large part, we know virtually nothing about the genetic changes that occur in species formation. And what he says in his book, what he states, is that the immense theoretical structure of evolutionary genetics is an idol with feet, body, and head of clay. And so really biology is no help here. It can't be if Lewontin is right, and Grasset is right. Now, perhaps before I go any further, I should define precisely what I mean by creation and evolution. Now, certainly by evolution we mean more than just genetic change through time. There is genetic change through time. Mutations do occur, and certainly the next generation of humans will not have the same genetic combinations that we have. My children do not have the same genetic combination that I have, and I'm very happy for it. They're better looking than I am. But while that is change, that's not evolution. You see, there is genetic change through time, but the question is, does this genetic change that occurs change one animal into another animal? Can it be responsible for changing a single-cell organism into the millions of species that now exist? As a matter of fact, the entire theory continuum of evolution states that the universe came into being by natural processes, that life arose on this planet by natural processes, and that first single cell generated all the millions of species that we have today. Now, Dr. Robinson says it's not necessarily atheistic. No, I certainly, and I do not imply, nor do I state in my book or any other literature, that all evolution are atheists. As a matter of fact, I state exactly the opposite, and I make that very clear. But the theory of evolution is a mechanistic, naturalistic theory. The evolutionist says we do not need God to explain how things came to be. We can use presently occurring processes that can be observed and tested to explain the origin of what we find upon this earth today. Now, that's what he says. Obviously, then God is excluded, because if God is involved anywhere in this process, then he would not be able to make such a statement. So the theory of evolution says that everything upon this earth, all living things, have arisen from a single source through natural processes which can be ascribed to properties inherent in matter, and that first living cell in turn arose from a dead inanimate world. This is the general theory of evolution. That's the way I want to use the term tonight. I sometimes call it the fish to Gish theory of evolution. And so we understand clearly what we are talking about. Now, creation, on the other hand, we are not debating here tonight the biblical record story of creation. We are debating the two alternatives of spatial creation versus evolution. The creation model, we prefer to call it, which states that this natural universe could not have generated itself. It's incapable of doing so on the basis of natural processes that are now operating. Therefore, the origin of the universe and its incredible complexity must have been created by a supernatural creator, force, or God, whatever you choose to call it, external to and independent of the natural universe. You cannot do it. It could not have occurred by natural processes. Therefore, it must have occurred by supernatural processes. The God, the Creator, created certain basic kinds. Now, it's true that in all cases we cannot define the limits of the kind. But that's no difficulty that is spatially inherent to the creation model. The same is true of evolutionists. We can't even agree on the definition of a species, as a matter of fact. Species is supposed to be a population of individuals that are reproductively isolated from others. That's one definition, but that's not true. I mean, dogs, Canis familiaris, can and do interbreed with Canis lupus, a wolf, with species of coyotes of the genus Canis, and with jackals, and leave fertile offspring. Therefore, certainly that definition of species breaks down. We believe the created kind, just as we stated, been derived from a common gene pool. They would be expected ordinarily to be interfertile, and therefore we believe the dogs, the wolves, and coyotes are from a single created kind. We know certainly that fishes and reptiles are of different kinds. We know certainly that snakes and turtles and lizards and crocodiles are of separate kinds. We know that. We believe that, at least. So we can set certain limits, but now if we have two families of 143 species of owls, can we know whether each one of these species were a kind, or was a kind at the genus level, at the family level? That cannot always be known, and as I say, that problem is not unique to creationism. The same is true of evolution. You have lumpers and you have splitters and so forth and so on, and you get all different kind of definitions of genera and what should go into it. And I know Dr. Robinson has had a very long standing position on where he should place Australopithecus africanus. He calls it Homo africanus, and then the Australopithecus robustus, which is commonly accepted, he calls it Paranthropus. He puts it in a separate genera. He doesn't agree with most of the evolutionary world on that point. And so this problem is not unique. But God, we believe, created certain kinds. There's been a limited variation within the kind since creation. Now, so there's the two basic models, the creation model and the evolutionary model. Now, there are some precise predictions, by the way, that we could make on the basis of evolutionary theory. And if evolutionary theory is true, then these predictions certainly should be fulfilled. That's what would validate the theory. One thing would help to validate. We wouldn't prove it, as Dr. Robinson pointed out, and we don't expect anybody to prove anything. You can disprove things, or you can establish levels of credibility. Now, I think that can be done with evolutionary theory. For example, Dr. Robinson has referred to the palate of mammals and these so-called mammal-like reptiles. Now, according to the theory of evolution, these so-called mammal-like reptiles and mammals and the diverse kinds of mammals, man and the mouse and the horse, possesses this palate because we have inherited the same genes from a common ancestor that determined the palate. Likewise, our forelimbs are similar to the forelimbs of amphibians and reptiles and birds and other mammals because we have inherited from the common ancestor the same genes that gave rise to the forelimbs of man and the forelimbs of reptiles and the forelimbs of other mammals. Now, there has been some modification of these genes since, but they would be called homologous genes. You would recognize that the genes which determine the forelimbs of man are very similar to the genes that determine the forelimbs of reptiles. Obviously, if this theory is true, this is what must be the case. We must be able to find homologous genes. What is the case? All attempts to discover homologous genes have ended in failure. As a result of this, Sir Gavin de Beer has published this Oxford Biology Reader in 1971 entitled Homology, an Unsolved Problem. Now, please, ladies and gentlemen, get the importance of this. So much in evolution, so much evidence depends upon this so-called homology of common structures, structures found in different animals which are nevertheless quite similar. Now, there are some cases, of course, where evolutionists believe that the homologous structure evolved later and independently. They call that parallel evolution or convergent evolution. But many, or perhaps most of these similarities, similar structures should be because we have inherited the same genes from the common ancestor. That's the evolutionary philosophy, the evolutionary belief, the science, so-called, of evolution. But when we examine the genetics of these homologous structures, we find that the genetics are entirely different. I quote from this booklet, the Oxford Biology Reader, by Sir Gavin de Beer, British evolutionist. He says, quote, "It is now clear that the pride with which it was assumed that the inheritance of homologous structures from a common ancestor explained homology was misplaced. For such inheritance cannot be ascribed to the identity of genes. The attempt to find homologous genes except in closely related species has been given up as hopeless." End of quote. He further points out, now if you take homologous structure, for example, the vertebrate eye, the eye of man, and the eye of a reptile, and the eye of other mammals, all other vertebrates, we have the mammalian eye, not reptiles, but yes, vertebrates, all vertebrates, fishes, reptiles, mammals, man. We have the same eye, very, very similar in the structure. Now the assumption of evolutionists is that we have the same eyes because we inherited the same genes from a common ancestor. We have a little problem there because the squid has an eye very, very nearly identical to that of the vertebrates. But the assumed common ancestor in the squid and the vertebrates had no eyes. And so the evolutionists must assume that by chance, by random accidental processes, generated this marvelous structure called an eye with its iris, pupil, lens, millions of rods and cones and special muscles and all that to manipulate it. That incredibly complex and coordinated structure evolved by chance, not once, but 2 times at least. But now when we go to these vertebrates and trace the eye back to the gene level or any other homologous structure, we find that we come to entirely different genes. Now listen to the incredible proposition of Sir Gavin de Beer and H.C. Harland and others. In the light of this evidence, they are now suggesting that while the genes in evolution can change completely so that you cannot recognize this gene over here in man and this gene over here in the reptile as being related at all, they're completely different. Say the genes govern the eye, that these genes have changed so completely, they're wholly altered, and yet the structure governed by those genes, the eye, have remained unchanged. Now that is absolutely incredible suggestion. What is evolution? It's the change of the genes, and therefore genes change, so structures change. But now when they look at the actual genetic evidence, they find that the eye has remained exactly the same, but the genes in different animals which govern those eyes, which determine those eyes genetically, are totally different. And so now they are forced to suggest this incredible suggestion that the genes can change, they can evolve, change completely, but the structure doesn't evolve. Now that completely demolishes any genetic evidence for evolution. Completely. And it absolutely, totally contradicts any prediction that they would have made on the basis of evolutionary theory. Now, I think we should deal with another point, and that's the probability factor. Now, while natural selection is not a random process, ultimately all of evolution is dependent on mutations, which are random changes. Nothing says it should happen, it's needed, therefore it ought to happen, it just happens. Random changes are made. Typographical errors, mistakes are made in the reproduction of these creatures. Mutations are mistakes. They are random. And according to evolutionary theory, we started with a single-cell organism. As it reproduced itself, it began to make mistakes. Copying errors, or maybe the mutations or mistakes were generated by cosmic rays or ultraviolet light or other chemicals, something like that, but mistakes were made. Just about all of these mistakes were bad, as we would expect. Practically all of them were bad. And they're eliminated by natural selection by pure chance. However, rarely one of these mutations, one of these mistakes happens to be good. Just by chance, it changes the characteristic of the plant or animal, such that now it is a favored mutant or favored variant, and it can compete better than the original, and so it reproduces in larger numbers, makes a greater contribution to succeeding gene pools, and finally replaces it after many, many thousands of generations. Now the change is incredibly slight. Stebbins says these beneficial mutations produce changes so slight they're just imperceptible. Well, that's a very nice theory. You don't have to produce the evidence. But the essence of the thing is that these very, very, very rare beneficial mutations produce slight changes, and the accumulation of these slight changes over millions of years produces what we have upon the earth today. Now that's the theory. Ultimately, you see, evolution is due to these mutations, and they are random changes. It is as if I would take this page and I would blindly replace remove a letter and replace it blindly with another one. I look at it and see if it makes sense, if I've improved the message. If not, I throw it away, eliminated by natural selection. And I keep making random changes this way. And finally, you have generated the British Encyclopedia by such a process, which is really a rather small store of knowledge compared to what we find in a bacterial cell, as a matter of fact. But that's the essence of the process. Now, it's a random process. Let us compare this to the laws of probability. If it's a random process, it's got to follow the laws of probability. Absolutely. If you flip a coin, you got 50-50 chance it's going to come up heads or tails. You can calculate the probability that coin will come up, say, heads 10 times in a row. You can calculate the probability. Now, it might come up 10 times in a row the first time you do it. Not very likely. But you might have to do it a billion times before it comes up that way too. But you can calculate the probability. Now, you can do that in evolution, assuming that natural selection doesn't operate. Let's begin by assuming that natural selection doesn't operate, that it's absolutely, totally by chance due to these mutations. Now, Huxley has made a few calculations. Julian Huxley, in his book Evolution in Action, published in 1953, on pages 45 and 46, we see that Huxley has made some calculations. Now, he's made some very generous assumptions. He says, let's assume that of all the mutations occur, 1 out of 1,000 is beneficial. Of course, that's a ridiculous assumption. I mean, they're so very difficult to find and document, if they can be done at all, that they're much, much more rare than that. And he says it's very possibly they are. And furthermore, you see, every animal in every population doesn't undergo a mutation. Just few of them undergo mutations, and of those few that undergo mutations, only a very, very tiny fraction of those by any definition could be beneficial. But he says, let's assume that 1 out of 1,000 of these creatures has a beneficial mutation, and let us assume that it takes 1 million mutations to generate a horse from a single cell creature. Okay? 1 out of 1,000 mutations are beneficial. It takes 1 million of these beneficial mutations to create a horse, and that's very conservative, to say the very least. But it doesn't make any difference. The odds are so unbelievable. Now he says, let's take this as assumption. Now he says, with this proportion, but without any selection, we should clearly have to breed 1,000 strains to get one favorable mutation. 1 million strains, that is 1,000 squared, to get one containing 2 favorable mutations, and so on up to 1,000 to the millionth power to get one containing 1 million. You've got to breed number of individuals that would be equal, or generations, 1,000 to the millionth power to get one containing 1 million favorable mutations, converting a single cell creature to a horse. He says, of course, this could not really happen, but it is a useful way of visualizing the fantastic odds against getting a number of favorable mutations in one strain through pure chance alone. 1,000 to the millionth power, when written out, becomes the figure 1 with 3 million knots after it. And that would take 3 large volumes of about 500 pages each just to print. Actually, this is a meaninglessly large number, but it shows what a degree of improbability natural selection has to surmount and can circumvent. 1 with 3 million knots after it is a measure of the unlikeliness of a horse. The odds against it happening at all. No one would bet on anything so improbable happening, and yet it has happened. It has happened thanks to the workings of natural selection and the properties of living substance which makes natural selection inevitable. End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, here we have a marvelous thing. We have an absolute impossibility. The chances that we're going to get the horse is 1 chance out of 1,000 to the millionth power. That's 1 chance out of a number 1 followed by 3 million zeros. A most unbelievably large number. Take all the universes, billions times billions times billions times billions times billions times billions times billions of universes, cram them completely solid with electrons, and you'd have no number this large at all. That number is so incredibly large. All right, that's the odds against getting the horse by mutations, random mutations alone. But he says, how did it happen? Natural selection made it happen. A natural process, ladies and gentlemen, took an impossibility and made it certain. Now, ladies, what kind of a process could overcome these kinds of odds? 1,000 to the millionth power, the odds against it. No natural process could do that, and it's precisely what the creationists have always been saying. There's no natural process that can overcome odds of that kind. And those odds are really great compared to the odds against getting a living cell from non-living chemicals. You see, natural selection has become Huxley's God. He thinks this way: the horse exists. That's the fact. We'll agree to that. The only way it could have gotten here is by evolution. And the process by which evolution works is natural selection. So it is a fact, then, that natural selection created this horse against those odds. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll pardon me, I remain unconvinced. And creationists are not alone in that respect, by the way. There are evolutionists in this world today who don't believe it either. Some of these are mathematicians who are very well acquainted with these laws of probability and the biology involved and all of the assumptions involved, that there are certain ratio of favorable mutations that natural selection operates, but ultimately all of evolution is due to random changes, processes. Just as if you deal a deck of cards, you shuffle a deck of cards, the cards are randomly arranged, now you deal out the cards. You can say nothing about what particular deal will be dealt to anybody else. You can calculate the odds against getting a certain deal, but you can say nothing about who's going to get what deal, whether it's going to be good or bad. Now, these evolutionists took these assumptions, and they took all this information, put it in their computers, and asked the question: how long would evolution require to produce a complex organ from a simple thing? How long would it take to generate a man from an amoeba or some small creature? The answer came back: by this sort of a process, time required would be billions of times longer than 5 billion years. Not billions of years longer, but billions of times longer. And this assumed process, based ultimately as it is on these random changes, could produce nothing more than trivial changes within that amount of time, and certainly could not do what it's supposed to do. Well, their evolutionist biology friends didn't like that at all, and there was a heated argument between the mathematicians and the biologists. So the Wistar Institute brought the mathematicians eyeball to eyeball with the biologists, evolutionary biologists, 25 of the world's leading evolutionary biologists, and let them fight it out. And the Wistar Institute published the results of that symposium in 1967 in the book called Mathematical Challenges to the Neo-Darwinian Interpretation of Evolution. One of the chapters was written by Dr. Murray Eden, professor at MIT. Dr. Eden is an evolutionist. All of these people were evolutionists. None of them were creationists. But in his chapter, in that book, published in 1967 by the Wistar Institute Press, on page 109, we find the following statement by Dr. Eden. Quote, "It is our contention that if random is given a serious and crucial interpretation from a probabilistic point of view, the randomness postulate is highly implausible, and that an adequate scientific theory of evolution must await the discovery and elucidation of new natural laws, physical, chemical, and biological." End of quote. Notice what Dr. Eden has said. If random is given a crucial interpretation from a probabilistic point of view, which it is, all evolutionists will say ultimately evolution is due to these random mutations. This randomness postulate, he says, is highly implausible. We do not have an adequate scientific theory of evolution. We cannot explain the origin of living things and the diversification of living things by this supposed process, and perhaps in the future we may discover some new laws, physical, chemical, and biological, which then may give us the explanation. A man is saying that what we know right now, everything that we know in science, tells us that this supposed evolutionary process cannot work. It could not have done the job that it's supposed to have done. Now, I find it incredible that Dr. Robinson and other evolutionists say that we can assume that evolution is a fact, about as well as we can assume anything in science. And we find other evolutionists saying that we have absolutely no credible theory of evolution at all today. The facts of science that we do have would demonstrate that this theory could not have worked. It could not possibly have produced what we have upon the earth today. This is precisely what the creationists have always been saying. We're saying that no random chance process guided by naturally occurring mechanisms and processes could produce these incredibly complex living things in 5 billion years or 500 billion years as far as that's concerned. And indeed, their origin did require a creator, a supernatural creator who is intelligent, can think, an omnipotent, omniscient creator. At least, whatever we can say about the creator, he was adequate for the job. We have an adequate cause to explain the effect. But the evolutionists do not have an adequate cause to explain the effect they are postulating. Now, let us take a look at the fossil record. Now, we do contend that the fossil record contradicts the theory of evolution and supports creation in a most remarkable way. Now, of course, if evolution was true, we would have vast numbers of transitional forms. Evident transitional forms. There would be no discussion, no question, no argument. If a single-cell organism has slowly and gradually changed into millions of species over hundreds of millions of years of time, vast numbers of these transitional forms would have been produced. Practically everything, as a matter of fact, it seems to me in the fossil record would be transitional. Most of these things would be. You couldn't miss if it took 100 million years for an invertebrate to evolve into a vertebrate, as it is stated, or 30 million years for a fish to evolve into an amphibian. The number of transitional forms would be enormous. There'd be no doubt about that evolution has occurred. But on the other hand, if creation has occurred, we would predict that we would not find these intermediate forms. We would predict an explosive appearance of complex forms of life without ancestors. Ladies and gentlemen, that is precisely what we do find in the fossil record, regardless of statements by Dr. Robinson and other evolutionists. And I want to document that statement from evolutionists, not from any creationists, but what evolutionists themselves have to say. Now, perhaps in the rebuttal period, well, let us have that first slide. Maybe we turn on the slide projector. I want to show at least one slide at this time. Here's the kind of animals found in Cambrian rocks. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to get drawn into the discussion of how these rocks were formed or the time of the rocks. There's a very fruitful discussion, I'm sure. We don't have time to discuss the time problem and so forth and so on. Let us just simply point out, regardless of how these Cambrian rocks were formed, regardless of the time when they were formed, regardless of the method that they were formed, in those rocks we have fossils of tremendously complex creatures. The trilobites and the branching sponges and the jellyfish and the swimming crustacean Sydnea that you see on the slide, and the sea urchin, and sea cucumbers and worms, brachiopods, creatures so complex that evolutionists say that their origin would have required nearly 3 billion years of evolution, of slow gradual change from some simpler form. Ladies and gentlemen, nowhere on the face of the earth do we find ancestors for trilobites, for the sponges, for corals, for sea urchins, for sea cucumbers, for that swimming crustacean, for the jellyfish, for worms. Nowhere do we find the fossilized ancestors of these creatures. They do appear explosively complete, as we would predict on the basis of creation. Simpson, as a matter of fact, has characterized the absence of these Precambrian ancestors as the major mystery of the history of life. The evidence here that we find is precisely what we'd predict on the basis of creation. But nowhere on the face of the earth, from the bottom of any ocean or on any continent, can we find the ancestors, the fossilized ancestors of these creatures. It's explosive appearance of highly complex forms with no ancestors. Furthermore, it is assumed by evolutionists that one of these invertebrates gave rise to the vertebrates, or the fishes. 100 million years of evolution between the invertebrate, whatever it was, a worm or a jellyfish or who knows. One or the other has been suggested at one time or another by evolutionists as the ancestor of the vertebrates. But whatever the ancestor was, there's not one single transitional form in the fossil record between an invertebrate and a vertebrate. There's absolutely no evidence in the fossil record that the invertebrates gave rise to vertebrates. I defy anyone to produce these transitional forms. 100 million years of evolution, ladies and gentlemen. But when the fishes are first seen, they're complete, and they're assumed to be the first vertebrates. Complete, internal skeletons, bony armor plates, and so forth. And the different kinds of fishes appear without ancestors in transitional forms. For example, I have with me a paper published in the Proceedings of the Linnaean Society of London, volume 177 in January of 1966. The article was written by Dr. Errol White, then president of this society. Dr. White is an evolutionist. He's an expert on fishes. The article is about the lungfishes. On page 8 of this article, Dr. White makes the following statement, quote, "But whatever ideas authorities may have on the subject, the lungfishes, like every other major group of fishes that I know, have their origins firmly based in nothing." End of quote. And he italicizes the word nothing to emphasize it. Every major kind of fishes that he knows has their origins firmly based in nothing. He goes on to say, "I've often thought how little I should like to have to prove organic evolution in a court of law." And he makes some very, very interesting statements for an evolutionist. But he frankly states that these different kind of fishes have appeared without ancestors in transitional forms. At least that's what the fossil record, that's the evidence in the fossil record. Now you can make any other assumptions you want, but that's what the evidence indicates, and that's, you see, would support our position, the creationist position. Now, here on this slide we see the fish that is supposed to be ancestor of the amphibian, and there are certain characteristics in that fish that evolutionists believe would make it a possible ancestor. The nature of the vertebrae, similarity of the vertebrae, the fact that it had bones in the fins, which might have been transformed to the feet and legs of the amphibians, some similarities in the skull pattern and so forth, as well as many, many dissimilarities. But now look at those two creatures. You may assume, if you wish, that the fish gave rise to the amphibian, but look at the fish. It was absolutely 100% designed for life in the water. Had a lovely set of fish fins, beautifully designed for locomotion, balancing and steering in the water. The amphibian, on the other hand, which is supposed to be the world's oldest known amphibian, has the basic amphibian limb, feet and legs. And there are no transitional forms in the fossil record between those two, in spite of the assumed 30 million years of evolution. Now here are things that we can trace very nicely. Feet and legs versus fins. You don't have to involve the little subtle distinctions between reptiles and mammals osteologically. Most of the obvious differences between a reptile and a mammal is the mode of reproduction and other physiological differences. But here are some very, very obvious differences. And if one evolved from the other, certainly we would find that documented in the fossil record, but there is no evidence for that. As we see here in this slide, here's an exhibit from the Chicago Museum of Natural History, evolution of the amphibian from the fish. On the right you see the fish, the left the amphibian, and in between you see a remarkable transitional form, half fish and half amphibian. But if you read the fine print under the transitional form, you'll find that it is labeled inferred intermediate, strictly imaginary. The great fossil collection at Chicago could not produce it, nor in New York, nor here on this campus, nor in any museum in the world can produce the intermediate form between fish and amphibia, so the artist is asked to produce the intermediate form, but hardly a scientific solution. Here's the fish, by the way. This is coelacanth, the very close cousin to the ancestor. I supposedly became extinct 70 million years ago, but found to be alive and well in 1939, and he's still very much the same fish, no evolution in that creature. Here's a flying reptile, supposedly evolved from a non-flying reptile, very, very different. You see, flight would be the ideal test case, as far as the fossil record is concerned, of evolution versus creation, because you require a revolution in structure to get a non-flying animal into the air. And you have 4 different classes of animals that fly or did fly. These extinct flying reptiles, the birds, flying insects, and flying mammals or bats. So we have multiplied opportunities to produce the transitional form. But in no case are these transitional forms forthcoming. Here's the flying reptile, very different. Notice particularly the 4th finger. According to the theory of evolution, some of these mistakes occurred, the mutations made the 4th finger get a fraction of an inch longer. For some strange reason, it's had some survival value. He reproduced in larger numbers compared to the original with a slightly shorter finger, and he replaced it, and then there were many more mutations, and somehow rare mutations over vast stretches of time, so the finger got longer and longer and longer. And more of these mistakes generated the flight muscles, the wing membrane, the hollow bones, and finally we ended up with this flying machine, Rhamphorhynchus. Here's another flying reptile, different kind of pteranodon in the lower portion of the slide. He did not have jaws and teeth, so according to the theory of evolution, the jaws and teeth slowly and gradually changed into this very long, as a matter of fact, 3-foot long, toothless beak. And some little knob on the back of the head presumably evolved into that long, bony crest. And in this case, the 4th finger supported a wingspread up to 52 feet. I don't know about you, but I'm glad that critter is extinct. But according to the theory of evolution, some land reptile gave rise to these flying reptiles through very slow and gradual change over millions of years of time. Ladies and gentlemen, there's not a trace of an intermediate stage in the fossil record. Not a trace. These flying reptiles appear just as you see them, complete, and no intermediate forms have ever been found. The same is true of the flying insects. You have non-flying, you have flying, but you have not a single intermediate in the fossil record to document the evolution of flight in insects. As a matter of fact, evolutionists argue among themselves which structure gave rise to the wing. Find one intermediate and you'll settle the controversy. Now here's the Archaeopteryx. This is supposed to be the classic case for evolution, the show case for evolution. It has always been presented to me as evidence for evolution. Although it's obviously a bird, as anyone can see, it had feathers identical to the feathers of a modern bird. It certainly had wings and perching feet, the bird-like skull. It was a bird. And there are no intermediates between this bird and any reptile, or between this bird and any other bird. But evolutionists say he had quite a few reptilian characteristics. They say he had claws on the wings, which is reptilian, indicating that he evolved from a reptile, and he had teeth. Well, of course, modern birds do not have teeth, but in the fossil record, some ancient birds had teeth and some didn't, but there's nothing intermediate whatsoever in the fossil record. Furthermore, some fishes have teeth, some don't. Some reptiles have teeth, some don't. Some amphibians have teeth, some don't. Most mammals have teeth, but some don't. Most of you have teeth, but some don't. But, of course, that's irrelevant to the discussion. But the presence or absence of teeth really says nothing, ultimately, about the ancestry. Furthermore, there are a number of birds today that have claws. The hoatzin of South America, the turako of Africa, and the ostrich has 3 lovely claws, every bit as reptilian as the claws of Archaeopteryx, but they're certainly, the ostrich is not an intermediate form. Well, I think the final blow to Archaeopteryx as a transitional form has been dealt just in the last few months. I have with me an article published in Science News, volume 112, September 24th, 1977. Now, in this article is revealed the fact that paleontologists, that is the scientists who study the fossil record, have recently discovered fossils of what they consider to be an undoubted modern type true bird in the same rocks in which we find Archaeopteryx, the upper Jurassic rocks. And therefore it's true that modern birds were contemporary with Archaeopteryx. How then could Archaeopteryx have been the ancestor of the bird? As a matter of fact, Professor Ostrom of Yale University is quoted as saying that it is now obvious to find the ancestors of birds, we must look in formations much older than those containing Archaeopteryx, because Archaeopteryx cannot be the ancestor. Well, there goes Archaeopteryx. There's one of those beautiful cases that persisted for many, many years, made a beautiful story, proof of evolution, but it's gone by the wayside. Well, we could cite, finally I want to point out the bat. Well, here's another one of the imaginary transitional forms found in a natural history museum in Washington, D.C. We see the supposed proavian, the intermediate between the reptile and the bird, and strictly imaginary, strictly the product of the artist. No transitional form can be produced. Here's the bat, supposedly evolved from a land mammal. Obviously, tremendous changes to convert a land mammal into this bat. The gradual extension of the length of the fingers, the generation of the wing membrane, flight muscles, and so forth. What evidence do we have? Well, here is a picture taken from Science, December 9th, 1966. A picture of what is supposed to be the world's oldest known bat, dated by the authors at 50 million years. They said nothing related to a bat remotely has ever been found that's any older than this. In the center of the picture, we see the actual fossil bone and then the reconstruction of what the bat must have looked like. All right. According to the evolutionists, then, here's the world's oldest known bat. And what is he? 100% bat. Essentially identical to a modern bat. He appears abruptly in the fossil record, fully formed, no transitional forms and no evolution since his first appearance. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we can argue back and forth, as Dr. Robinson does. Well, we have some examples here. We have some examples there. Here are the most obvious changes, easily traceable changes, supposedly took place over many millions of years of time, and yet in every case there are no intermediate forms. And we can do this again and again and again for everything that has a unique structure, such as the dinosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, the horned dinosaurs. Creatures like that appear abruptly without ancestors. The armored dinosaurs, with some with spikes on the head, some spikes on the tail, and so forth. But in every case, they appear abruptly, without transitional forms. Now, just in case some of you have said, well, I'm being pretty clever, I've cited examples where there are no transitional forms, but there must be many. Let me quote from some evolutionary authorities as to their evaluation of the fossil record. Dr. E.J.H. Corner in Contemporary Botanical Thought, published in 1961. Dr. Corner is a botanist, he is an evolutionist. On page 97 of that book, Dr. Corner, this botanist, this evolutionist says, quote, much evidence can be adduced in favor of the theory of evolution from biology, biogeography, and paleontology, but I still think that, to the unprejudiced, the fossil record of plants is in favor of spatial creation. End of quote. This evolutionist says that, to the unprejudiced, the fossil record is in favor of creation, not evolution. That's a 1961 paper, and by the way, Dr. Robinson, in my book, I do quote from a 1960 publication of George Gaylord Simpson. If you check my book on the fossil record, you'll see the quotation where he says, while the differences, or the lack of intermediate between species is sporadic, the absence of transitional forms between the higher categories, the orders, the classes, and the phyla are systematic. And that is what I was saying concerning Professor Simpson. The higher categories, the created kinds, the transitional forms are systematically absent. Now, from Professor David Kitts, the University of Oklahoma, a man who got his PhD in vertebrate paleontology under George Gaylord Simpson, a man who's an expert on the fossil record, a man who is an evolutionist. In the journal Evolution, Volume 28, 1974, in his article, Paleontology and Evolutionary Theory, Professor Kitts makes the following statement on page 467. Quote, now this is from a 1974 publication. Quote, despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. End of quote. Now I say, if there's loads of transitional forms, I wish somebody would write a letter to Dr. Kitts down there and get that man straightened out and tell him about all these transitional forms, because as a result of his study, he's convinced there are no transitional forms, quite obviously. What someone assumes to be transitional forms, he does not consider to be valid evidence for transitional forms at all. He says the fossil record does not produce these transitional forms, although evolution requires that the fossil record produce them, or they would require their existence in the past. Now, another man, that's a 1974 publication, another man is Dr. Richard B. Goldschmidt in a 1952 publication. Goldschmidt, most devout evolutionist, just pointed out the fact that as far as the fossil record is concerned, the facts of greatest general importance are the following. When a new phylum, class, or order appears, there follows a quick explosive, it is in terms of geological time, diversification, so that practically all orders or families known appear suddenly and without any apparent transitions. End of quote. Goldschmidt says classes, orders, families, phyla, down to including almost every family, that these things appear abruptly, fully formed, no transitional forms, just as we would expect, by the way, on the basis of creation. Now, Goldschmidt offers an alternative explanation, an alternative mechanism that he called the hopeful monster mechanism. Now, here's how we explain the gaps, Goldschmidt said. We don't have slow and gradual evolution at all. Look, there's the gaps. They're real, absolutely. These different kinds of creatures have appeared instantaneously without intermediate form. That doesn't support this neo-Darwinian theory of evolution at all, gradual change. So he says, or he suggested what he called the hopeful monster mechanism. Goldschmidt suggested, for example, a reptile laid an egg and a bird was hatched from the egg. Now, I admit that would certainly explain the absence of the transitional form. This beautifully does that. If you will accept his incredible hopeful monster mechanism, which very few people did. Must have been a tremendous shock to Mama Reptile, and even a greater shock to Papa Reptile. Probably would have sued her for divorce. But now the question is, why did Goldschmidt feel forced to propose this incredible hopeful monster mechanism? For one reason only: because transitional forms are not found. They cannot document gradual change. And so he adopts the hopeful monster mechanism, this incredible hopeful monster mechanism. Not a shred of evidence to support it. And he says no one has ever seen this happen, but he says neither has anyone ever seen one animal slowly and gradually evolve into another. Now you say, well, that was 25 or 30 years ago. Right here in my hand, I have an article published in the June 1977 issue of Natural History by Stephen Jay Gould, professor at Harvard University. Stephen Jay Gould is widely known in evolutionary circles, in biology and geology and so forth, about evolutionists. His articles are entitled The Return of Hopeful Monsters, and he says he's predicting the next 10 years that Goldschmidt will be fully vindicated. We have to go back to the hopeful monster mechanism, because he says the fossil record with its abrupt transitions offers no support for gradual change. He says all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major grades are characteristically abrupt. And he goes on to point out, after all, what good would a halfway form be anyhow? What good is a half a jaw or a half a wing? Well, that's what the creationists have been saying all the time. So he wants to accept the hopeful monster mechanism. Yes, thank you. Well, I think that's absolutely incredible. I tell people, if you want to believe that, go right ahead. But I find the concept of special creation to be much more reasonable and credible explanation of the evidence.